And let me say, folks, if I seem to be talking slowly, that's intentional. I've been consulting and teaching for a long time, and I know we have an international audience, so I want to make sure everybody gets the full benefit of this. So you can see here we're going to talk about learning objectives. And you see my in scope, on budget. That's what we care about. So firstly, what are the reasons some project managers and projects are failing? This presentation is actually a hybrid of several presentations I've been doing. And I had initially started with why projects fail, and then the assessments, and then when I got hold of a report, it sort of pulled everything together. So you'll see as we go along, there are a couple of different things here that I'm addressing, but they pull together nicely, I think. We'll understand how the 360-degree assessments, that's 360 degrees, so that's, the project manager, his or her superior, team members, even customer in some cases, can pinpoint areas of needed improvement, if any is needed. And how project health checks. So part two of this presentation, first we talk about the 360 assessments, which is the project manager and his or her skills. And then we talk about the project itself and how we can raise the bar on it. So a little bit extra something for you in addition to just the assessments. So here's the agenda. What problem are we trying to solve? Because if there's nothing to solve, if it's not broke, we're not going to fix it. But sometimes things are broken. What are the top 10 reasons projects fail? I mentioned that a minute ago. I've been doing it from my own 20 years experience. I didn't go out to the internet and research that. It was just because I didn't want to copy from anybody else. I wanted to say, these are the reasons I have observed that projects fail. But then this report I'm going to show you talks about some reasons why projects fail. And it dovetailed nicely and reshaped my thinking. Then we talk again about the assessment process, assessing the project manager, and a project health check. I mentioned that already. This case study, when I first did the presentation, people were saying, about a year ago, people were saying, show me the results of this. And I work with partners. I'm in the Boston area. I work with partners in Australia for this particular thing we're going to be talking about. And I asked them for a case study, and they gave me a nice case study of an Australian bank. They've done these assessments for, I believe they told me, the 4 largest banks in Australia successfully. So we'll weave that in as we discuss it, because it really gives you a better picture. Now, a survey of companies was done. You see down here, a well-respected company, I believe they're in Pennsylvania, called PM Solutions. The gentleman that runs it is actually, I believe, a PMI fellow. Did a survey back in 2011. Now, it wasn't a huge number of respondents. I don't know if it's statistically perfectly significant, but I'll tell you what, it certainly mirrors a lot of what I've seen. But the respondents in the survey, and you'll see what the survey is about in a minute, C-level, VP level, so really the people we want to approach to say, how well are people performing? And we see the size of the organizations here, small, mid-sized, large, etc. Here's the problem. I'll have a little bit of a surprise bullet at the very end. According to the report based on the survey, firms manage $200 million in projects each year. During that time, they realized that 74 million, almost 40% of the projects are at risk of failure. Folks, I've been in this business 20 years, and that number has never changed. No matter what survey I see, something like 35 to 40% of projects fail. And it's so consistent, I think that people think, well, that's the cost of doing business. And I say that doesn't make any sense, because maybe we won't get it to zero, but we can bring it down. Now, many companies can successfully recover projects if senior management is willing and that you have the right project manager. If you don't have that combination, it's harder. Senior management has to say, we will respect your practices, and you need the right training or mentoring for that project manager. Firms with a standard project management methodology had fewer than half as many project failures. By the way, let me interject something that this webinar is not about. Even though I mentioned the Project Management Institute, and I'm aligned with them, and they have a book called The Project Management Body of Knowledge, this has a little bit of leaning towards that, but I don't have to be so aligned with them for this particular presentation. Somewhat, but we're outside of the scope of that. So the project manager body of knowledge is not a methodology. It's a body of knowledge. Methodologies are Waterfall, Agile, Prince2 in the UK. Those are methodologies. Almost all the organizations rated the skill and knowledge of the project manager very important to the success of the recovery, if we're failing. Now look at this whopping number at the bottom. The average dollars lost due to project failures per firm is a staggering $24 million a year. Now, I had to go back to the company and confirm that I was reading that right. The first time I presented this was at a PMI meeting, and nobody could believe it. But, some of you are doing significantly larger projects, but here in the United States, the government does huge projects, and around the world, every time you see a big project in the PMI in their write-up of the project of the year, it's invariably a wastewater treatment plant somewhere or a huge project. So it's a lot of money. We're talking real money here is being lost. That's really the bottom line. Now, why do projects fail? Well, there are many reasons. As I mentioned up front, I've been doing this top 10 reason for a couple of years, but then the report that I mentioned earlier highlighted their top 5. So I thought, well, let's look at their top 5 and you'll see my remaining few. 5. And by the way, when you see these, we could talk about these all day. I could do a webinar on just this. And I think we even have, but we can talk about that. But here are the issues, requirements. And I'll drill deeper in the next slide. Resources. So what are the requirements of the things I'm making, or the thing that I'm making, or the service I'm providing? First of all, people don't even understand what a requirement means. Do you know that a date is not a requirement? If your manager says, I require this service by September 15th, that's a constraint. It's not a requirement. And then when I talk to people, and no disrespect to the business analysts who might be on the phone, they don't know how to gather requirements, and the customer doesn't know how to articulate them. So here we are. Secondly, resources. Do you know, if you're a manager out there, where your people are at any point in time, what they're working on? Exactly. They're working on 3 projects at once, perhaps. Do you know where their time is spent? Schedules. Schedules are unrealistic. Someone says, I need it by September 15th, and we create a schedule that says September 15th, but it's not realistic necessarily. And by the way, I'm talking about reasons why projects fail. If your project is succeeding, then you're doing a lot of these things right. I'm talking about why they fail. Planning. I'll go back to the project management body of knowledge. It has 47 processes. 24 of them are in planning. What's the message there? More than half of the processes are in planning. PMI is not saying spend a month on planning, but at least spend some time on it before you execute. It's kind of like telling the architect, build my house and don't worry about a blueprint. And then risk management. Every project, unless you have an extremely well understood product, like I worked at a manufacturing facility, they had very low risk simply because their product was well understood and they did the same thing all the time. What if you have a research and development product? How well are your risks understood? Not to mention some of these larger projects. So you need to understand where your risks are. Now, the next 5 are my own observations. I'm going to drill deeper on the top 5 in a minute. Scope creep. This is when your customer, whether it's internal or external, says, I asked you for this, and now I need 50 more of these things, and you say, no problem. I will do it with the same staff, the same budget, the same schedule. And then you do it by heroics, and so they expect that every time. Communications. This is what I call the oil of the project. Without good communications, boy, you have many communication channels, and so that must be controlled by someone, and that someone is the project manager. And very often communications are chaotic. Stakeholder management. Do you even know who your stakeholders are all the time? Very many times I have people say, I think they're the same as last time. Do you know? Because they will come back later and say, why didn't you inform me? Well, nobody loves estimating, including yours truly. If I'm asked to estimate a project, I think, well, geez, that's going to take 3 days or 10 days or 20 days. You don't really know very often, unless you have this. The main industry I can think of that has a good estimating database is the construction industry.